Today, the Global Asia Initiative at Duke University is really pleased to interview our very own director, Prasenjit Duara. I am Yuan Julian Chen, Environmental Humanities Fellow of the Global Asia Initiative and the Franklin Humanities Institute. Professor Duara is the Oscar Tang Chair of East Asian Studies at Duke University, where he also serves as a director of the Asian Pacific Studies Institute and the Global Asia Initiative. Professor Duara received his PhD in history from Harvard University. Before he joined Duke, he taught at the University of Chicago, where he also chaired the Department of History. And later, he taught at the National University of Singapore as the Raffles Professor of Humanities and the Director of Asia Research Institute. Professor Duara have authored many influential books that not only resonate with historians, but also influenced other fields in social sciences and humanities. His works have been widely translated into many languages, including Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. Today, we are going to invite Professor Duara to reflect on some of his excellent scholarship produced in the past few decades, including his first book, Culture, Power, and the State, which won the Fairbank Prize of the American Historical Association and the Levenson Prize of the Association of Asian Studies. Professor Duara, in 1995, you published a groundbreaking book, Rescuing History from the Nation, Questioning Narratives of Modern China. This book has resonated powerfully with historians, but also with scholars working in other fields of social science and humanities. And of course, it applies to more than the narratives of modern China. It has been more than 2 decades, and actually almost 3 decades, after the publication of Rescuing History from the Nation. And the world has changed a lot since then. I'm speaking of all kinds of geopolitical changes in Eurasia. And of course, these changes will undoubtedly reshape future narratives of the 20th century and the 21st century histories. I think it is a great time for us to invite you to revisit this book so we can have a better understanding of nation state, nationhood, and national history. To start with, can you please first tell the audience what inspired you to write Rescuing History from the Nation in the 90s? Were there any particular events that made you feel the way national histories are currently being written are so problematic?
Thank you, Yuan, for having me on our own GAI interview series. For your question for nationalism, I had been thinking of nationalism for a long time. Ever since I wrote my first book, Culture, Power, and the State on North China, because I saw that nationalism in East Asia was quite different. See, my reference point was not the West, but India, where I grew up. East Asian nationalisms were much more organized, penetrative. They penetrated into the deepest recesses of the lives of families and individuals. Whereas I didn't see that kind of nationalism in the India where I grew up. I think in the West that also happened, but it happened more gradually and less perhaps activistically because it had a longer temporal span for it to develop. But East Asia I thought was very interesting, and that's what got me interested in nationalism in East Asia, and China and Japan in particular. 2 developments took place in the early 90s that influenced me. One was the intellectual developments in the whole deconstruction and subaltern studies and so on. And the other was the history of the Soviet Union coming apart, seeing these new nationalisms emerge, while at the same time globalization was going on. So I begin that book by saying it's not clear whether nationalism was coming into being or being taken apart by globalization. And what deconstruction really helped me to understand is how this ideology had been constructed. I should also mention that the period of 90s and early 2000s was really a period when deconstruction reigned supreme, and I think it was a very important moment because you could see how what we took for granted could actually be taken apart, that it had been constructed. But having done that and having seen the power structures involved in the deconstruction, I think it's time to reconstruct from that deconstructive basis, right, to find a more fair kind of solution. And part of that involves understanding why nationalism continues to arise so frequently, so resilient, as it were.
I see. You have used the concept of linear history a lot in this book. Can you please tell the audience what do you mean by linear history? And can you also give us some specific examples from China where linear history narratives are still prevalent?
I think the first thing about linear history is that it is the framework of a kind of a monodirectional and cumulative history, which in most early histories of the 20th century ended up in a future of progress, or ended up through the course of progress to some kind of teleological ideal of modernity or the end of history, as Fukuyama would call it, right? When there was no more struggle, things worked as they should. And where these do not fit, where in fact there were lots of other directions in history that were taken up. As I said, the teleology is always that there's greatness at the core of a linear history, and the same core seeks to fulfill its potential at the end, right? So the end is always there in the beginning, right? As it unfolds into that. So that is really how a linear history is. In the book itself, I have several examples. I look at, for instance, the idea of fengjian, which we usually translate as feudalism. But if you looked right from the 1890s, the works of Liang Qichao and the Hunan group and so on, all the way to the Federalist movement, the Liansheng Zizhi Yundong in the 20s, you see that fengjian is understood in its more traditional sense as decentralization, you see. And at one point, Liang Qichao even says that, you know, a lot of these Western countries and Japan had feudalism. What he meant was had decentralized systems. And that's how they could, in fact, develop self-government and things like that. This was, in fact, a movement that became quite strong, but the interesting thing is you get to see it is the changing meaning of the word fengjian. As soon as it comes in from Japan as just feudalism in the Marxist Western sense of the word, it becomes a no-no, and it becomes, in fact, a kind of a curse, and a lao fengjian. You know, it loses that potential that could have moved Chinese history in a different direction. So that's one example, I think, of it. There are also others that I use, like Coming. Coming, of course, referred very much to the mandate and how, in fact, the early 1911 revolutionaries employed that in order to gain the support of various secret societies and so on, that this will be a return to the mean. But these secret societies did not find themselves, and they did wear robes, Ming robes and everything in their uprisings. But of course, it was a transition to a completely new revolution, which is what Coming also became. So these were the kinds of things that one could uncover, quite apart from, you know, movements, the anti-superstition movement and the reaction that produced and so on, which showed that history could have gone in different ways, but is structured in a way to move towards a certain ideal.
Thank you for the explanation. I totally agree with you. So I would like to ask you about how should historians deconstruct linear histories and national histories. But I think you yourself have already provided a great example in your first book, Culture, Power, and State, Rural North China from 1900 to 1942, which you actually published in the late 1980s before rescuing history from the nation. And this book has won you many prizes, including the Fairbank Prize and the Levenson Prize. I think this book itself is already a challenge to linear history writing. So I wonder if you can tell us, why did you choose these villages in rural North China in Shandong and in Hebei in particular as the focus of your studies. And if possible, please give the audience who are unfamiliar with that history some brief introduction of what powers and forces were at play in these North China villages.
Well, first, let me say that I wanted very much to work on rural society. You know, when I emerged from the Indian situation to come to America to study China, I'd already done a fair amount of China study in India. My interest was trying to see how something like the Chinese Revolution could not happen in India. And I was trying to understand how it happened in China beyond what all was said. So I wanted to study villages. And my teacher, Philip Kuhn, was singularly helpful, not in the sort of ideas that I was interested in, but he was helpful very much in showing me where and how to get this information that I needed. And he pointed me to the Mantetsu researches, which I had not been familiar with.
I just want to quickly add a footnote to people who don't speak Japanese. Mantetsu is Manchurian Railway.
Yeah, Mantetsu is Manchurian Railway. And he showed me these 6 volumes of the Chugoku no Son Kanko Chosa, which altogether have 1 million characters. And, you know, as a graduate student where I didn't have much else to do, I read every one of those 1 million characters in the 6 volumes over about 2.5 years. It turned out to be a fascinating source, not so much to talk about revolution per se, but indirectly to the questions of the revolution. So, you know, the Mantetsu was the biggest research organization in the world before World War II. And its researchers were not necessarily always aligned to the Japanese imperial interests. In fact, the bulk of research, and certainly the bulk of people who were doing rural research, were in fact leftists of one kind or another who went to China to sort of see how things were happening in China. Some of them wanted to do something, some of them wanted to see if the communist revolution was in fact taking place or how it could be developed in some way. And I had interviewed several of them, very, very sympathetic folk. A lot of them got into trouble later with the Japanese military, but they did incredible work of peasant interviews, of farmer interviews in these areas. And ultimately, I did come to some conclusions. Much later, in 2011, in India, I published an essay which got to the question finally of whatever the Indian Maoist uprising was at that point, which was a small movement, and it's comparing it with the Chinese Revolution, which, as you know, was a big movement. And then with that book, I also realized that one of the very significant developments that differentiated it from the West and from a place like India was that in China, nation building and state building were taking place simultaneously. This makes a difference in relation to the West because we see that a lot of the Western national developments and state development took place much earlier. And national development was also assisted by a lot of European resources being collected from the rest of the world, right, as foreign conquests were taking place. Marxists call it primitive accumulation. Somebody at Harvard calls it war capitalism and so on. But these resources were very important for 18th and 19th century development of Europe. And of course, you know, the Chinese didn't have that option. So ultimately what happened was that the agrarian sector became the source of primitive accumulation for capital formation in the industries, right? So you had these very elaborate policies. So that's a later story.
So in this book, you have described your methodology as, quote, going back and forth from domain to process to other domains, unquote. How does this methodology help the readers better understand the life and the society in Shandong and Hubei villages in late Qing and Republican period. I know you probably have a better concept to describe this, which is circulatory history, and that is in direct contrast to the linear history you criticized. So I wonder if you can give us some explanation of circulatory history in light of this book.
Well, I did begin to have problems with that, but at that time, when I was a graduate student in the early 80s, I was unhappy with just writing a straightforward historical account. And I wanted very much to sort of understand the concept behind these materials or that we were looking at. And so that's what I meant by going from domain to process to domain. So, for instance, I was looking at all these state extractive ideas, and I was looking at all extractive processes, and I was looking at the anti-superstition and setting up schools processes which were often opposed in great numbers by the peasants. And I was trying to understand how and why they did that. And of course, I went back, modernization theory would tell you something that this was modernity and modernization towards that goal. But I also happened to read Charles Tilly on state making and state building. And so that I understood much more the domain in which was happening, that you don't only understand it through modernization, but through state building, which was a separate process. But it was a separate process that extracted a huge toll, particularly in the Chinese case, but probably everywhere in the world when power was being gathered into the modern state form, right? And all that transformation and all those lives that were lost all over the world in this process. That's what I was looking for, different forces moving in different directions. And I've often come back to state building as something much more important than the modernizing that becomes the end in itself. To go back to your methodological question, gradually I find that looking for these alternative directions rather than goals, I've been moving kind of progressively in my own work. That's how I got to, in rescuing history, the idea of bifurcated history, right? So I would say that there was not just one direction in which history was moving, there was a counter direction as well, right? So for instance, the Fengjian was a very different kind of mode than the revolutionary nationalist mode, right? It was sought to assert provincial autonomy and so on in this form. And also to understand what and why and how farmers were opposed to their temples being destroyed and to the taxes being applied. And because they were not getting immediately any benefits from these temples being destroyed or changed into schools even. We had these different directions. Then we come to my last major book, The Crisis of Global Civilization, Asian Traditions and a Sustainable Future. And there I developed the idea of circulatory histories, which is different from, but relatable to bifurcated histories, right? Where I say that historical processes ought not necessarily be seen in terms of their origins in a single nation or a single place or something, but are always joined to and joined by processes that have been circulating around the region and often move from one place to another, get changed, but that change also moves to another place, gets changed again. And sometimes it may come back in a changed form, whether it's recognized or not. And I use, of course, the oceanic metaphor for these kinds of circulations. That's how my methodology has evolved.
Thank you for bringing us to your latest book, even though I should have mentioned that when I frame my question when I asked you about circulatory history.
Okay.
Now I wonder if we can proceed to discuss a relatively more recent book, but before the sustainability book, Sovereignty and Authenticity, Manchukuo and the East Asia Modern. I would like to ask you, what prompted you to write this book on Manchukuo almost 2 decades after rescuing history from the nation? And I think Manchukuo is a great topic to study modern nation state, but I think many people are unfamiliar with Manchuria, and Manchukuo. So it would be great if you can first give the audience some background information about Manchukuo and about its place in Chinese history, East Asian history, and also world history.
First, I think there wasn't such a gap between rescuing history and Manchukuo. In fact, when I wrote the final version of, or the proofs, or revised the submitted copy of rescuing history, I was in Dongbei. I was in the Northeast, in the so-called Manchukuo. So it appeared about 6 or 7 years after. It seemed to me that Manchukuo, which is the northeast of China, and was claimed by China, certainly by the late 19th century, the Qing government, which had kept it apart from the mainland of China as its own native home place, began to open it up to settlers from China once they began to note Russian incursions and Japanese incursions into that region and feared that it would be taken over. Well, we don't know if it was just protecting the state or protecting the nation at this point, but it allowed Chinese settlers to come in. And within 30 years became a Chinese majority. And by 50 years, it was about 90% Chinese, that region. So there's no question that from that demographic perspective, it certainly belongs to China. Why did I get to that? To me, it seemed like a very interesting case, a laboratory, as it were, of seeing how a nation is being constructed. Because the most interesting thing about Manchukuo, it's been known through the movie The Last Emperor. Probably the only thing educated people know about Manchukuo is The Last Emperor, where it's seen very much through the eyes of Puyi and the Japanese colonists, or puppeteers, should we call them, because it was always called a puppet state. The Japanese military, sometimes in contest with the Japanese government and with the Japanese military headquarters as well, the Kwantung Army, it was in the hands, the real power was in the hands of the Japanese. But they did set it up as a nation, as a model of a nation. And this was something that was the global trend of that time, that imperialists sought not to distinguish themselves as different from those that they colonized, as the British and the French and the Europeans had done. But even, for instance, the Germans sought to create a kind of a Germanic area where they forced people to speak German and things like that. So it was really part of imperialism seeking to justify itself as a form of nationalism, right? As a form of nation building. But the thing that interested me, and it was in many ways a very cruel state, lots of people were killed, and they had this very notorious gas experimentations where they used humans, Chinese, as guinea pigs for their things, which often killed them for their experiments. And so these were the kinds of things that had been written a great deal about. But I thought enough time had passed that we could try and understand this form analytically. And the way I tried to understand it, because they were trying to build, they in fact even offered the case to the League of Nations as an independent nation. I mean, it couldn't be seen as independent. I mean, it reminds you very much of the Ukrainian war in some ways. It's as if the Russians were more successful and then thought about building a sort of a nation. And what I saw was that Manchukuo was constructed from materials that were at once local, regional, including Chinese and Japanese, and global, right? So I was trying to see these three layers and how they circulate. So in a sense, this was also an intermediate movement towards circulatory history, right? How these different forces circulate, braid with each other and go into the construction of something called the nation, which then gives you a window into understanding how nations themselves are constructed, right? Which they also have layers of global and regional and local, and how these braid and how they develop and how they circulate onwards. So that was my interest. It was a more abstract intellectual interest, but I had a lot of materials as well.
One of the materials I really like that you painstakingly analyzed in the book is this book called Green Valley by Liang Shanding, right?
Yes.
So I wonder if you can tell the audience something about this book. Who is Liang Shanding and how is Green Valley related to Manchukuo and its authenticity?
It's very hard to find things on Liang Shanding. You know, he was a writer in Changchun, I think it was, or maybe in Shenyang. When he wrote this, the Japanese actually banned part of it because they thought it was a covert critique of Japan. But then later they allowed it. We don't see much of him in the records. But then a research assistant of mine found him in a later 1937 East Asian Literature Conference being held in Beijing. So we don't have much information about him, but the book is important. Green Valley is important because it was really one of the first Chinese texts that tried to create what in Chinese we call the native place novel, right? It becomes so important 50 years later in the 80s and 90s in Chinese literature, right? And many of the themes that Liang Shanting sort of establishes as a way to see, understand, and value Dongbei as a region, the native place literature in the novel is based on the authenticity of the pristine forests and hills and mountains of Dongbei. And it opposes it to the corrupting city and capitalism, the building of the railroads, and the future markets shaping lives. He uses this very wonderful term, you know, of the futures market, which becomes very important in soybeans and so on. He calls it Maikong, right? You buy something empty and you sell something empty, right? He's very critical of all that. And he has an elite protagonist, a young boy who grows up with his servants and so on, goes through all kinds of struggles through having lost his home, his Chinese family's home, and the railroad is not, they are not able to gain from it, and he's kidnapped and this, that, and the other. He comes out of the forest recognizing the importance and value of nature, and ends up in the city in Shenyang, I think, where everything is locked out, all his property is lost and everything. And so he returns to the forest. So it's a romance about forest life and how modernity is corrupting it. At one level, this does also echo Japanese ideas of the authenticity of nature and so on, which they often counterpose to Chinese attitudes towards nature. At the same time, the principal capitalists and the railroad builders and the futures markets were controlled by the Japanese. There was a contradictory element here. I think he was, at some points, maybe during the Cultural Revolution or the anti-rightist movements, identified as a collaborator. But at other points, in Dongbei itself, the novel is well regarded as a beginning of native place literature, as one of the beginnings. Of course, you also have people like Xiaohong and Xiaojun and so on writing, but this is a major novel.
Thank you for an introduction of Green Valley. So I wonder, how does the case of Manchukuo challenge linear history and national history writing in China?
The case of Manchukuo allows us to see how the formation, this goes back to the point I made earlier about 3 levels, right? So we begin to see how it resembles both China and Japan in many ways. And many of these ideas that come to be formed in China and Japan, and that look very authentically Chinese or Japanese, could be global. The way in which I find that there are many circulatory forms that go into China that were also developed in Japan from other global forms, right? Usually Germanic or something. And the very idea of looking for the authenticity of a native place, right, is a new thing, both in, it may not, I don't know about Japan, but it's certainly a new thing in China and in Manchukuo. And they both develop it at the same time. Yet a lot of it comes from Japanese ideas of kyodo or shangtu writing, right? Which itself was influenced heavily by Germanic ideas of Heimat, right? And there's continues to be an influence of why you must understand your place and particularly its natural quality. Of course, there are English traditions and so on as well. But this was not so much the celebration of regionalism and of a whole region was not a strong element in traditional Chinese culture, partly because of the central state, right? Tifang referred to anything under the Zhongyang, under the empire, right? And so Tifang was a very broad concept and did not necessarily have a literary descriptive quality that I'm aware of. We tried to look for lots of regionalist sort of ideas and cultures in pre-modern China, but we see it much more as a modern form.
Thank you. Lastly, I would like to bring the interview back to the present in the 21st century. As I mentioned in the beginning, the world has changed a lot since the publication of Rescuing History from the Nation in 1995. Can you let us know what's your opinion on the implications of all these geopolitical changes since 1995 till now? What are the implications of these changes to modern nation state, nationhood, and national history writing?
National history writing has changed a lot in the West, in the academic West, because state projects and popular projects continue to be nationalistic. I don't think that has changed very much. Although, you know, elements change and goals change. It can go from being in China, being anti-American to more anti-Japanese after the Cold War, and then go back to being more anti-American at this point and things like that. And similarly, on the American side, can go to being anti-Russian, to being anti-Chinese, to being anti-Russian and anti-Chinese and all that stuff. So that is a pretty simple issue. But, you know, I have a view on this, which is that I see nationalism as functioning at the deepest temporality, the slowest temporality in the circulations of different forms in the world. And nationalism, I will identify as a kind of a tribalism, as a self-other distinction, appears to be the dominant ideological form, an identitarian form that underlies other ideologies for the last 200 years and maybe 150 years in Asia. It has fundamentally not changed. What has changed are the different levels. Say at an intermediate level, you can have regime change. You can have changes from, say, in India, you can have a more inclusive Congress party moving to a more exclusive Hindu nationalist party. In China, you can go from a KMT to the communists, and within that, you have various changes as well. And of course, you can have policy changes and events and so on in the Brodelian sense at the most superficial level. But I think there is a sedimentation which also changes. I mean, that's not to say that nationalism as a self-other mechanism will not change or will not change its role, but it's a very slow change if it does change. And we have seen it circulate over 200 years. And I think it still functions. And the thing about nationalism is that, I want to make this distinction between this so-called civic nationalism and ethnic or racial nationalism, right? The one, civic nationalism, is often identified with democratic societies in Western Europe and so on, which is believed to be inclusive, right? And racial nationalism is identified more with the German model, right? Which believes that, only the core population has that kind of thing. The further upon it, there is the addition that civic nationalisms tend not to be warlike, whereas ethnic nationalisms, I think, do. This is a very simple understanding because things change. I mean, you can look at America now as being riven by a civic and a racial nationalism, right? And so that can always raise its head, and Britain too, to some extent. So these sort of exemplars of civic nationalism have a very strong, they're bifurcated, right? They have a very strong undercurrent of this other dimension, this one that really puts self-other at the fore, right? And defines the self. I mean, the self can be also defined in different ways at different times, but the structural idea of the self-other and the exclusion of the other is very important. And I think that we have to understand how historically this self-other idea is either submerged or appears, right? And one clue is given by Karl Polanyi, the economist who was writing mostly pre-war, quasi-Marxist economist, who argued that about open and closed forms of nationhood. And he says that during periods of economic prosperity, when capitalism is on the rise and booming, then you have more open interactions. But when crisis sets in, and they always see capitalist crises as global crises, right? Then, in fact, they close up and become more exclusive. And obviously, we can understand this through the different periods through when nationalism becomes very assertive, right? As we have now, as we saw in the Depression and all of these. So that's one way of thinking of it. There's another way also that I usually use and try to combine with this, which is the idea of the competitor, the latecomer nations. The latecomer nations often need to, and this is the classic case of Germany and Japan in pre-World War II, of latecomer nations wanting a part of the global pie itself, finding that you have very established imperial and now national powers there, and that they will therefore develop this exclusivist dimension much more. But during crises, Polanyi says that this is also an opportunity for a society to close off and rethink and renew itself and close itself from the other world. There are two patterns. You did this with the welfare state in Britain and the New Deal in America. But on the other hand, the Nazis and the fascists took the other route of aggressive nationalism, right? So you have these two, and they can easily revert. The role can change, and you can have a much more aggressive nationalism in what was seemingly a very settled and inclusive nationalism.
All right. Thank you so much, Prasenjit.